On August 23, 2024, Sony-owned developer FIREWALK Studios would release their first game. After a long development cycle and a reportedly exorbitant budget, Concord was ready to set the world ablaze and become the flagship title that would carry Sony to the live service promised land. Unfortunately, instead what would come to pass was arguably the largest commercial failure in video game history. So before we talk about what happened after that fateful Friday in late August, we should probably first talk about what Concord was and how it came to be. Our story begins back in the hazy, distant days of 2016 in the city of Bellevue, Washington, where several video game veterans decided to form a new studio by the name of Probably Monsters. Headed by former Bungie chairman and chief executive officer Harold Ryan, Probably Monsters would ultimately serve less as a developer and more as a parent company forged to establish other AAA game studios. In the years that followed, Probably Monsters would do just that, and the byproducts of their efforts included developers such as Cauldron, Battle Barge, and perhaps most ambitiously of all, FIREWALK Studios in 2018. Founded and staffed by big names from first-person shooter royalty such as fellow Bungie alumni Ryan Ellis and Ella Siegman, and former Activision executive Tony Hsu, all of whom had worked side by side on the Destiny franchise, FIREWALK was also partially funded by Sony, who worked with Probably Monsters to develop the studio and nurture its growth. In fact, according to Ellis himself, Sony had supported the studio from the very beginning, and had even encouraged them to work in a separate 1,500 square foot office space to make sure they were able to develop their game securely. All of this would lead to Sony initially securing the rights to publish FIREWALK's first game, and though several staff would leave in 2022, including Siegman, the studio would continue to grow in size, employing hundreds of developers by the end of that year and only more in the year that followed. By 2023, FIREWALK had swelled to around 150 people. Under the stewardship and support of Sony, the studio had grown exponentially in the last 12 to 24 months and was now at a size and scale that rivaled many teams on other AAA productions across the industry. But on April 20th, 2023, Sony would take its support of FIREWALK one step further and would announce that it would be buying the studio, bolstering its portfolio of first-party developers and turning the game that the studio had been working on for many years into the next big PlayStation exclusive. As part of the announcement, they also stated that other recently acquired studios, including Bungie and Haven, would also be contributing to the as-yet unannounced game's development, and also that the title would be a simultaneous release on both PlayStation 5 and PC. Just a month later, in May of 2023, FIREWALK would formally announce its first game as Concord, a shooter set to release in 2024. At the time, the reaction from both the press and audiences was a little muted, but the existence of Concord was intriguing nonetheless. While Sony's big push towards live service seemed to indicate that this would be some kind of online-driven experience, Concord's first trailer gave little to nothing away about what the game might be. But 2023 was a big year for games, and between some of the biggest and most critically acclaimed releases of the last decade, there was little room to remember this enigmatic announcement. However, unfortunately for Concord, people would remember its next trailer, but for all the wrong reasons. On May 30th, 2024, PlayStation would host a pretty standard State of Play showcase. Amongst the updates and announcements, the world would get its first true look at Concord, with first gameplay footage, character reveals, and perhaps most infamously, a cinematic trailer. While we'll talk more about the gameplay in a moment, it's worth noting that these two latter elements of Concord's big reveal would be its most damning. Aiming to capture the irreverent tone, humanity, and soul of something like a Guardians of the Galaxy, Concord's cinematic trailer failed on almost all fronts, depicting at best a bad imitation of its inspirations, and at worst some of the most cringe-worthy humour and dialogue seen in a new game reveal trailer for some time. From the "well, that just happened" tone, to the one-to-one character archetypes, the whole thing just felt out of touch, and for want of a better word, forgettable. While things would improve ever so slightly when it came to the gameplay footage, what FIREWALK had to show would unfortunately inspire similar levels of apathy toward the project. While both Sony and FIREWALK had stressed Concord's focus on story, making the strange decision to release a new pre-rendered cutscene every week to keep players logging in, it was clear now that the game was yet another hero shooter, a market both oversaturated and waning in popularity with modern audiences. After all, winning in this space would mean toppling the likes of Overwatch or Valorant, and it seemed that Concord was bringing little new to the table to take on these behemoths, let alone defeat them. While the game looked more than competently made, and even fun in places, it all just seemed like a swing and a miss for Sony's latest endeavour. However, as part of this announcement, PlayStation also gave first details on a closed beta test for Concord that would occur sometime between May 30th and its planned release date of August 23rd, 2024. But while you might be thinking that maybe the gameplay would be good enough to turn Concord's fortunes around, or maybe the beta would explode in popularity with gamers across the world, the truth was that things were only going to get worse for this ill-fated shooter. Concord's first closed beta would occur on July 11th and ran for a few days. This beta was reserved for those who'd pre-ordered the game, but any and all who did were also given 5 beta codes to distribute amongst friends and family, should they too wish to give Concord a try. Now, while we have no data for how many players took part in this closed beta on PlayStation, as there's no way to track it, an important point for sure given how much this game was being supported by Sony, we do have hard data for the number of players who took part on PC, and it would be an understatement to say that they were not good. Across the closed beta, the maximum number of concurrent players for Concord on Steam was just 1,100 players. To put that in perspective for you, games like Valorant, Concord's main competition, average around 400,000 concurrent players, and even Valve's new MOBA shooter DEADLOCK, a game that may be aiming for a slightly different audience for sure, but was also in beta at the same time, hit over 80,000 concurrent players during its pre-release testing phase. In short, these numbers were woefully bad. But that was just the closed beta, right? How about the open beta, when anyone could give it a try? Well, when this ran from July 14th to the 16th, Concord, despite being free to play for any and all who wished to give it a try, managed to only up its numbers to just under 2,400 players. Such data painted a grim picture for Sony's latest live service bet. Concord, even at a free price point, at what should have been the height of its marketing push and hype, was failing to even break 2,500 players on Steam, the biggest gaming platform in the world, and no amount of extra unaccounted for players on PS5 was going to be able to balance the spreadsheet. However, while you might think that this was as bad as it could get for Concord, FIREWALK and Sony, things were about to get a whole lot worse come release day. Concord released on August 23rd, 2024 to mediocre reviews and almost no player acclaim, failing to even chart in most territories. While some outlets and content creators spoke highly of the moment-to-moment gameplay and shooting mechanics, the high price point to entry, coupled with some baffling progression systems and matchmaking, and a lack of player count, meant that ultimately, most did not recommend it. Almost as quickly as the release date came and went, so too did any small amount of intrigue from players. Within a week, it was clear that Concord was totally and completely dead on arrival, and a reported 8-year development cycle had gone up in smoke. However, if the story had ended there, then perhaps we could remember all this simply as another cautionary live service tale of trend chasing gone awry, but it seemed the revelations that came next would somehow recontextualize Concord and its development once more, and make the story of its creation even more incredible. While hard data is hard to come by, several industry analysts placed the final sales numbers of Concord for both PC and PS5 at around 25,000 copies, 10,000 of which were sold on Steam and another 15 on PlayStation. To put this in perspective, HELLDIVERS 2, another Sony-funded and published live service, sold 1 million copies in its first 3 days and would go on to sell 12 million copies in its first 12 weeks. But things get even worse when converting these numbers into financial losses, especially when comparing such revenue to how much Sony had spent to produce Concord in the first place. If these numbers are even remotely accurate, 25,000 copies sold mean that Concord will have made just under $1 million. While not confirmed, sources inside FIREWALK and Sony have put the cost of Concord's production at near $400 million. While it's unclear if this includes the cost of buying FIREWALK Studios itself, and I for one hope that it does, this figure is astronomical and firmly places Concord as one of, if not the biggest financial failure in the history of the video games industry, with a net loss of an estimated $399 million. On September 3rd, 2024, just 11 days after its launch, Sony released a statement on the PlayStation blog announcing that Concord would be pulled offline on the 6th, due to the game, quote, not landing the way they intended, end quote. As of writing this, the game's creative director has already stepped down, and the rest of FIREWALK have reportedly either already left the studio or are awaiting details of a potential severance. While Sony does state in the blog post that it will be exploring other options regarding the game's future, it seems that both it and the developer now face uncertain times, and it's unclear if FIREWALK will continue to operate going forward. So the question now arises, how did all this happen? How did Sony, a veritable juggernaut in the gaming space, engineer and curate one of, if not the biggest financial flop in gaming history? Well, it seems that a culture of toxic positivity, unwillingness to take on board feedback, and a lack of understanding of the current gaming landscape all played their part in creating the perfect storm that was Concord's failure. Several developers who worked on the project have since reported a blind confidence by upper management and a leadership team who, despite any and all feedback, seemed convinced that Concord would be the next huge deal in the gaming space, acting as the flagship in Sony's new live service portfolio. The ultimate irony here is that, while it has some tonal issues and design flaws, particularly regarding progression, Concord wasn't even a terrible game, but none of that matters if you don't understand the market or your audience. It's very clear that some very talented people worked on this game, and also that they truly cared about making the best experience they could for players. This was not a cynical cash grab, but a misguided swing into a market that there was no hope of flourishing in from the start, coupled with a mandated business model seemingly built on greed and a fundamental misunderstanding of what the audience wanted. When I worked as a game developer, I was working at a large studio when PUBG and Fortnite exploded onto the scene. Suddenly, all the new games that were being pitched were pivoted to become battle royales, a move that ultimately ended in every single one of these projects being cancelled or retooled again later down the line. This kind of trend chasing is rife in the industry, as investors and people who don't give two shits about actually playing games continue to make decisions that serve only to try and earn them more money under the false guise of satisfying the consumer, and it rarely, if ever, works. Innovation over imitation will always win out in the long run, and for all the bluster about fostering a creative environment for studios to cook, this kind of pivoting and bandwagoning is only hurting both the game makers and the consumers. And then there's the studio and the devs themselves, often overworked and lied to throughout development, only to then take the fall when the game underperforms. While in this instance, there's been no accusations of crunch or overtly bad working conditions, the fact that none of the concerns about the game were listened to, coupled with the fact that the dev team now face unemployment after the game's commercial failure, is in and of itself extremely unfair, albeit all too a common occurrence in this industry. A few weeks ago, Sony unveiled its mid-console cycle refresh for the PS5, aptly named the PS5 Pro, which is set to retail at $700 and even more in other countries, including my own homeland of the UK, where for some reason no conversion has been made, meaning it's also £700. This means, by the way, that when converted back to US dollars, if you want to buy one of these things in the UK, you'll have to pay the equivalent of over $1,000 for it, for seemingly no reason. Thanks, Sony. Many have bemoaned this exorbitant price point, and rightly so, but some have even begun calling it a Concord tax, inferring that it's a method being employed to recoup financial losses after the game's failure. While this is almost certainly not true, all of it does speak to a larger storm raging both within Sony and across the industry as a whole right now. In the last 2 years, there's been way over 20,000 layoffs across the games industry, and many have left games altogether, as there's little for them now that the bubble has burst. Moreover, those at the top seem to continue to be protected, facing little or no consequences and often being rewarded financially for their mismanagement and continued malpractice. Couple this with the ramifications of such decisions, and the results are plain to see. Devs losing their jobs, games being cancelled or not preserved, and ever-increasing prices for the consumer. Whether it's a $700 console that comes with no disk drive, the firing of an entire dev team on the launch day of their new game, or letting half the QA department go on a project that was proven to have failed because of how it was managed and directed, not how it was tested, none of this is okay. And so here we arrive back at Concord, for in many ways it was the inevitable byproduct of this broken and exploitative system. A game undoubtedly made with passion and enthusiasm, steered and engineered into a place where failure was its only option. If reports are accurate and this thing cost $400 million to make, imagine how many copies it would have had to sell to justify those costs. Impossible, unsustainable, and opulent nonsense put into play by people who ultimately stand to make money or shift the blame of failure onto others, regardless of the outcome. The games industry has been broken for a long time, perhaps even forever, and Concord is the result. Whether it returns as a free-to-play title, or in some other manner, time will tell, And I suspect we will see Concord again beyond the planned Amazon animated short stories set in its universe coming at the end of the year, as Sony will undoubtedly be looking for some return on its investment, but ultimately, it matters little. The curious case of Concord is one that's taught many lessons, but I fear few of them will be learnt by those who matter. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then maybe drop a like and a sub. Also, let me know in the comments below what you think of the whole Concord situation. Till next time, as always, stay safe out there.